Join us as we search Alaska and beyond for mysterious creatures, featuring Beans Baxter and Rob Roy Menzies. This is the Alaska Bigfoot Studies. Hello, viewers, and welcome once again to the Alaska Bigfoot Studies. I am your host, Chuke. I wanted to talk about the siege or the attack of Ape Canyon because, in my mind, it is one of the most interesting stories in the lore of Bigfoot in North America, and I happen to believe it. Yes, there are a couple little holes in the story. We'll talk about that. But for me, it's very interesting because it was before the Patty film of the late 60s. It was in 1924. 5 miners went to the Mount St. Helens region where they had a gold claim. They were mining gold. And back then, Bigfoot wasn't a big thing. If you were local, living in Washington State, and you talked to any of the indigenous people, you would know about Bigfoot and Sasquatch and Hairy Man and some of the legends, but it hadn't reached the whole mythos or popular culture of the 1920s America. Absolutely not. There were reports popping in, for several hundred years in the history of this country, but back then it wasn't a big thing. So the fact that these guys had this experience really says something in my mind. It was very interesting at the very least. So what happened is they initially heard whistling. They started having these encounters, and definitely a group of Sasquatch. Now, first of all, Mount St. Helens is a huge hotspot. Some of my favorite stories were when Mount St. Helens erupted. During that time, there was a lot of Bigfoot activity because they were, Bigfoot was dying and they were trying to get out of there, and people were seeing them left and right. That Washington in general and those hard to reach forests, the thick forests, the mountains, just a huge hot spot for Bigfoot. And I actually believe that Bigfoot exists there. I've talked to friends who have had encounters there, but Mount St. Helens especially is a hot spot, and that was the rough area. I think it was east of Mount St. Helens where these guys were mining gold. Now, one of them saw Bigfoot, and it was, making some shrill noises, hiding behind a tree. Initially, he took a couple shots with a hunting rifle at this pine tree from 100 yards, and a lot of people discount his story because they say, well, you can't see bark fly up from you hitting the tree and a gunshot at 100 yards. And he said, I know it sounds crazy, but try it sometime, you'll see. And I absolutely do believe you can see an impact at 100 yards. Sure, it's going to be small, but if it's a good-sized tree, and they have good-sized trees in Washington, you can see the impact, and you could see bark flying at 100 yards. So they angered the Bigfoot, and it turned into this siege where the Bigfoot, group of them, they saw 3, but they heard many more, attacked their cabin. Now, this was, a cabin that they had made that was pretty sturdy, but it had, little slots in between the logs, and that's where they were looking at them and they were shooting through. And these creatures were about 7 feet tall, not super shaggy, but covered in hair and ape-like. That's why they call them these ape creatures. And they were just flinging rocks and thudding and got on the roof and banging on the cabin and just all night harassed these guys. Now, some of the stories were exaggerated. Even one of the miners, said, well, yeah, some of it was exaggerated. People claimed that giant boulders were thrown and they were coming through the walls and through the roof. That did not happen. Most of the rocks were small, a couple good-sized ones that they were chucking pretty hard, but it was mostly just the animals scaring them. And at the very end, Fred Beck supposedly shot one and it fell off a cliff. That was after they stayed up all night being harassed. They were taking shots. Supposedly they would, get a clear view of them, but they didn't shoot them, and they would call out, we're not going to harm you, leave us alone, and, we won't harm you, you won't harm us. I believe if they were that frightened and they were being attacked with rocks and stuff, and they saw one, that they would have shot it. But that's just one hole in the story. And then the insane part is at the very end, Fred Beck shot one when it was standing on a cliff. They waited all night. They're heading out in the morning, shot one, and it fell off the cliff. Now, the media, it turned into a circus back then. It got picked up, and that's where the exaggerations happened. I believe the Wildlife Service lied because they went back and investigated, said the prints were made up. There's no real thing. I don't believe that, because if you talk to, a seasoned wildlife official, somebody that works in the parks, they know about Bigfoot in Washington State. So I think the staff just didn't want the media to know about that, the wildlife officials. But it turned into a big circus, and, all we have was the stories. One of the guys did publish a book through his son. His son interviewed him and published a book later on, and that's interesting. I'd like to read that. But really interesting case. But so what do we have in Alaska? I would say Port Chatham would kind of be our big, Siege of Ape Canyon story for Alaska, but really there's a lot more, and there's actually some similar ones. Port Chatham was just, this cannery, small village was terrorized by a Bigfoot, and somebody might have died. There's a big engine block being thrown around. Really fascinating story, and that's absolutely a hot spot on the Kenai Peninsula. But when it comes to Bigfoot and these stories, I think a lot of these stories happened. We hear the echoes of some of them, but think about it. In the 1920s, Alaska was not that populated, and the Bigfoot hotspots, which were very rural, we have Alaska Native villages where things like this happened. It wasn't making the papers. I mean, it would be like several days' ride just to come to a reporter and report it. And, they didn't have the infrastructure that Washington State had in the 1920s, even before that. So I think all kinds of things like this happened, and especially in the interior, huge hairy man hotspot, and we have stories like this. But where I've heard the most similar to Ape Canyon would be southwest Alaska. So you have Bethel is the hub village, and you've got all these little villages around it. One of my buddies, Patrick, I've talked about him in his stories, lived in one of those hub villages and Bethel, and he said the people absolutely knew about Bigfoot, and there's lots of stories. He turned me on to the Delta Discovery. They haven't done anything recent, but over the years, they collected these hairy man articles and published them, and guess what? Some of them were very similar to the ones of the Siege of Ape Canyon. Particularly the one that strikes me is the guy, the hunter that shot a Bigfoot in Alaska, southwest Alaska. So what happened is, he probably got scared, saw a big, massive, hairy creature, shot it, and then they got mad, and he, freaked out. He went home, but guess what? A group of Bigfoot followed him home, and they harassed him for a while, probably doing the same thing, throwing rocks at his house and that kind of thing, getting on the roof, until they were able to scare him away, or it ended. So that was one story in the Delta Discovery. Just a weird, terrifying story was a story of a Bigfoot ripping a dog in half. Typically, you don't hear stories like that. I mean, that's an angry, vicious Bigfoot. And I've talked about, I think the Bigfoot in certain areas of Alaska are not very nice creatures. They're nasty. They will hurt you, compared to like Northern California, where, they may throw some rocks and bang some logs, but they're not just going to kill you, rip you apart and eat you, like in some areas of Alaska where they might do that. So Western Alaska, we had a few stories like that, and I think that it happened a lot. We had especially in the beginning when Alaska wasn't that populated with, all this modern stuff, that a lot of these stories happened and just didn't get picked up by the media like the Siege of Ape Canyon did. So if you have any stories, message me on the website, comment in the comments down below. I really appreciate you guys. We're going to try to get out and do some expeditions this winter. And it's Chuke, your friend in the field.